Hi friends. Alright, hold up. So, I wasn't actually planning on making this video, and that's because I wasn't actually planning on reading this book. But then, okay, not that anyone cares, but long story short, I got into a class about Victorian novels that I didn't think I was going to be getting into this quarter, and that's why in one of my videos, if you watched it, I talked about reading obscure American fiction, which I wasn't very excited about. But then I did get into this class. Yay! And our first novel we just read already, and it was Jane Austen's Emma. So today I'm going to be talking about that, and if you're curious, I'm also going to be reading Great Expectations, that's next week, Middlemarch by George Eliot, which I'm super excited for, as well as Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. So, a lot of fun classic literature to look forward to, but yeah, I just decided randomly to sit down and film this video because why not? I'm also here in a new location in my apartment because I've been scouting out better locations to shoot in my tiny apartment. And I'm having a snack as we talk, so hopefully it doesn't bother anybody. Let me start off by saying that I loved this book. I thought it was so enjoyable to read. So that's first of all. I actually have read it before when I was a kid. I had totally forgotten that I'd read it, but when I was around 12, I picked it up, and I remember like all of the plot points as I was reading it this time. I was like, oh my gosh, this reminds me of my childhood. Anyways, I found it so entertaining to read into all of these little social interactions between the gentry and the lower gentry and the landed gentry, not the aristocracy, because Jane Austen didn't really write about the aristocracy, but all these different social rankings between the characters in this novel was very entertaining to read about. And also, yeah, I loved this novel, but I had a lot of issues with it as well. I didn't feel like Austen was being progressive enough, which is ridiculous because with classics like this, you kind of have to read them in the context of the era in which they were written. And so it would be really unfair of me to say, Austen, why weren't you like criticizing the rigid social hierarchy? Because of course she wasn't. She was just a woman in society, and how do you have perspective on society while you're living in it, you know? But I found a really hilarious review on Goodreads hating on this book, and I kind of want to read parts of it and respond because I had a lot of the same issues, so I totally relate. But I ended up at the finish of the book really happy that I'd read it because it's fun for me. I'm into all of like the nuances and like ridiculous problems that come up in Victorian chatter that they like to write about at this time. Okay. The first thing that this person wrote was that they hated Emma because she was a vain and arrogant main character. And yes, she is. She's a terrible person. I love how on the back of the book, she's described by Austen herself as a character whom no one but myself will much like, just because she is a terrible person objectively, but we kind of grow to love her in the same way that she's like an anti-hero. She's not a villain exactly, but she just messes up everybody else's life because she's so selfish. And I find characters like that kind of compelling in their own way. I don't know about you. I don't always want just a typical hero as the main character of a story. I hope none of you have that thing, what is it called? That disorder where you really hate listening to the sound of people chewing. I'm gonna look it up. Oh, misophonia, yeah. I hope none of you guys have that. I'm so sorry, but I just got out of class, so I'm eating sesame crackers. I think what makes it extra fun to have such a terrible character is to know that Austen is critiquing her and satirizing her in the process of writing her. And it's fun to kind of get that extra layer of perspective. Also, tangential, but this was written at the time when novels were just coming to be, and so like the novel form was still very flexible and experimental because nobody really knew what they were doing at this time. This is like one of the first major novels of this form, and so Austen is on a very close third person on Emma, but she sometimes has this sort of free and indirect discourse style where she goes into Emma's head and we get what she was thinking, and then we also kind of get a judgment about her from the outside. I don't know if that made any sense, but I'm gesturing a lot, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I just really appreciated that. I think it's fun to see the actual style of a novel developing in this book as one of the earliest, and especially that I'm reading a bunch of other contemporary novels from my other class, as some of you may know. And so it's really fun to like get to compare the newest to like the beginning of the style, if that makes sense. Back to our review that I'm responding to. They also hated Miss Bates. Miss Bates is a character in the story who's of the lower upper class, and by that I mean there's like the gentry, and Emma, our main character, who some people think is kind of villainous, she's like the highest of her neighborhood, and then Miss Bates is like the lowest of her neighborhood, barely clinging on to the bit of social status that her family had. And she goes on for pages and pages about things that seem super trivial and honestly are super boring. Even I felt like I was snoozing while I was reading through some of those passages, but we were talking about it in class today, and I think that Austen does it so that she can use that character to subtly put details in that she would otherwise just have to like objectively tell you as the omniscient narrator. And so it's kind of her way of getting around that and making it seem more realistic and having hints being dropped by characters within the plot as opposed to just like her as the narrator, which I think is actually pretty cool. The way people talk, I love this. This person on Goodreads talked about this moment in the book where Emma and her father go on for like pages about this pig that they slaughtered and are sending to one of their friends because it's a very nice gift, and they got really annoyed with just the pleasantries and like the quality of discussion that goes on. But I think it's one of the charms of the book. I think it's so entertaining to read this old style of language, and so for me that's actually kind of a pro. I don't think this book is for everyone. It's for people who enjoy this style of literature, and like, to be honest, it doesn't really have a plot, and that's actually the next thing that this person wrote in their review as well, that like the plot's basically non-existent. I mean, there's several different romances going on in the book, but there's no real arc. Although I will say Emma has character development, which is nice to see. It's not like one of these well thought out and intricately planned things like you'll see in like Dickens. It's much more about the realism, but I think that's also one of the strongest parts of the book, is that it really pioneered this form of realism that's ubiquitous nowadays. We were just talking about it in class actually. Austen was so focused on these tiny, minute details and the way in which people regard each other, the relationships that characters have within themselves and with the world that they exist in, and will write down these tiny little nuances that make it really feel like you as the reader are inhabiting this world that feels quite ordinary, but just in the way that it's written, that ordinary circumstance and those ordinary characters are brought up to this higher level of making them really fun to read about and interesting, despite the fact that they're not like epic heroes and it's not specifically like a genre plot. We talked about like picaresque novels, and it's not really that. And this style, this realism style that came up with these Austen novels, is now like the forerunner of styles. I mean, you see realism everywhere nowadays. Almost all the contemporary books I'm reading are written in a style pretty similar, obviously not as detail oriented or minute, but still quite committed to this idea that the ordinary everyday lives of everyday people can be interesting enough to make up a novel. So that was my little tangent. Moving on. Like I mentioned earlier, one of my biggest issues was with the level of satire, or I should say the absence of satire or criticism towards the social order, this lack of questioning of it, I guess. And that's because at some points earlier on in the book, the main character is shown to try to help out this lower character. So Emma, the high character, is trying to help out her friend Harriet, who is of questionable parentage, and so she's of the lower gentry, and Emma is trying to help her by setting up a match between her and one of the eligible bachelors who are wealthy and higher class than she is. And by making that match of lower woman to higher man, she is kind of breaking the social order and breaking the expectations or norms of that society, which I thought was really compelling, even for a character who's kind of meddling in other people's business when she shouldn't be, which I still think is fun. But then at the end of the book, Emma has this character arc where she realizes her morality with the help of a man, which is pretty misogynistic. Mr. Knightley comes in and he's literally the knight in shining armor saving the day, as his name would suggest. But her moral education actually ends up making her more traditional in her belief around social class as opposed to more progressive. So rather than thinking she was right in trying to match somebody of lower and higher class, she thinks, wow, I was really wrong in trying to do that. Why was I trying to mess with the real rank of people in society and the order and the way things are? I should just leave everything be. Harriet can marry someone of her own status, which is a farmer, which she does end up marrying, and I will marry my knight in shining armor and basically get everything that I deserve because I was born into it. And so even though Austen does satirize Emma's character and sort of criticize her early on, and we see her as kind of someone we can make fun of, by the end it doesn't really seem like Austen's making a point to say Emma's wrong. In fact, it seems like by the end we're supposed to grow closer to Emma in her realization that the way things are is the way things ought to be or should be. There's even actually a line that I highlighted that's literally that, word for word, like, this is the way things should be. And so that is kind of frustrating, but obviously that doesn't take away from Austen's genius, honestly. Like, the fact that she was a woman of middle class in this time and was writing and was completely unknown. She had to figure out a way to publish her own books. In her entire 20-year writing career during her life, she made £1,000, which is like pretty much nothing. And she didn't really get recognized until she died. And after she was dead, she was recognized posthumously, but during her lifetime, she was writing anonymously too, so nobody knew that it was her. And I just think that is so wonderful and admirable, and I hope that she stays a part of the canon for a very long time, because she definitely deserves to be there, and the classics that she created are truly remarkable in the way that they pioneered so many things, like the realism that I was talking about, the form of the novel, the free and direct discourse, and the characters. Obviously, she wasn't the first to do all of these things, but she was really seminal, if that's the right word, in sort of forming this new category of entertaining reading. All I have to say is that it's a really fun read. I feel like if you have the time to enjoy it, which I really didn't because I was scrambling to read this in time for my class and I read it in about 3 days, but if you have the time and you are somebody who's predisposed to enjoy some of these longer, trivial seeming descriptions and discussions, but you like all of the class nuance and stuff, and you feel like you want to get transported back in time and place, then I highly recommend it. I love Jane Austen. I've only read one other book by her, Persuasion, and as far as how it ranks, I think Persuasion had a tiny bit more of a plot line, and this one sort of lost the thread of any semblance of a plot sort of in the middle and lost its momentum, I think. But I don't know if it's just because it's a childhood thing that I read when I was a kid, but this one holds a more special place in my heart, I think. So as far as Austen novels, this one is my new favorite. And yeah, thank you guys for watching and joining me here in this little corner of my apartment. I hope to make more book review videos for you very, very soon. So thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you later. Bye.